Assalamu alaikum. Now we're going to continue where we left off yesterday when we started the lecture of neuroanatomy and we were discussing the spinal cord. Now we have gone through the gross features and the arrangement of gray matter and white matter and the different groups of neurons or nuclei which are present within the gray matter. And now we come to tracts. Like I said, the white matter of the spinal cord consists of nerve fibers, and these nerve fibers can either be entering from the periphery or outside the body, bringing in sensations, or they can come from the higher centers like the cerebral cortex or the cerebellum or any supraspinal level, and they will come down to the spinal cord. And in this way, we can say that the sensory information carried from different parts of the body by a group of nerve fibers, when they group together, we call them ascending tracts. Why? Because that sensory information will be carried by different nerves. It will enter the posterior horn according to the relevant nucleus of the posterior horn, and then these fibers will ascend to the higher centers so that information can be synthesized. So, because they're going from below upwards, we call them ascending tracts. On the other hand, motor output from the higher centers, such as cerebral cortex, cerebellum, and other supraspinal levels. When fibers descend from those higher centers to the anterior horn of the spinal cord, and it affects the body for voluntary movement of skeletal muscles, we call them descending tracts. So, tracts are groups of nerve fibers. So, when they come together, we call them tracts. Tracts that ascend from the spinal cord upwards, carrying sensory information, are called ascending tracts. Tracts which bring down information from higher centers to the anterior horn of the spinal cord for motor activity, they are called descending tracts. And they are tracts within the spinal cord which connect or act as a midway path, and they are known as intersegmental tracts. So you have ascending tracts, descending tracts, and intersegmental tracts. Ascending tracts carry sensory impulses through nerve fibers, and these nerve fibers will first relay in the dorsal root ganglion, which is present outside the spinal cord on either side of the posterior horn nuclei, and then they will go to the posterior horn nuclei and ascend to higher centers. Like I said, the dorsal root ganglion is present outside the spinal cord. It is a collection of neurons near the posterior horn. I showed you this yesterday. This is actually a very simplified diagram of how information is going to be coming in and going out. For example, some kind of sensation coming in from the skin. This is the sensory nerve through which it will enter. This is the dorsal root ganglion where it will relay, and then its processes or nerve fibers will enter the posterior horn. That sensation will be communicated to the anterior horn motor neurons, and then they will affect skeletal muscles to react accordingly. So, this is a simple two neuron spinal reflex, afferent pathway and efferent pathway. A three neuron spinal reflex consists of an afferent pathway, and an internuntial neuron is like intersegmental, not intersegmental, but internuntial neurons are actually the neurons which will transfer information of the posterior horn to the anterior horn. So this is known as three neuron pathway: afferent pathway, internuncial neuron, and efferent pathway. This is a spinal reflex with three neurons. This is a spinal reflex with two neurons. I showed you this picture yesterday as well, but just to go through it quickly, this is the dura mater, this is the arachnoid, and this is the pia mater. This is the transverse section of the spinal cord showing the H-shaped gray matter, and this is the white matter surrounding it. Now, these yellow lines that you see, they are actually the anterior and posterior roots of the spinal nerve. Now, ascending tracts essentially, we talked about ascending tracts that they bring in sensory information, and then from the spinal cord, they will ascend to different levels. You have importantly the lateral spinothalamic tract, the anterior spinothalamic tract. Then you have two tracts which are present in the posterior white column called fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis. Fasciculus cuneatus has to do with conscious proprioception concerned with the upper part of the body, like the thorax and the upper limb. And fasciculus gracilis is conscious proprioception for the lower part of the body. Spinocerebellar tracts are two, anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts. Then there is a cuneo-cerebellar tract. I will briefly discuss the details or the important points of all these tracts, but for now I just want you to be familiar with this list. So we have lateral and anterior spinothalamic tracts, we have fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus, we have anterior and posterior spinocerebellar, we have cuneo-cerebellar, and then we have smaller tracts which are for specific sensory input: spinotectal, spinoolivary, spinoreticular, and visceral sensory. Now, I just want you to see this picture. You can see this is the posterior white column where I said you have fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis. And then here in the lateral white column, you have posterior spinocerebellar, anterior spinocerebellar, lateral spinothalamic, anterior spinothalamic. And then you have smaller spinotectal, spinoolivary tracts shown here. Now, ascending tracts, an important tract of the ascending group of tracts is lateral spinothalamic tract. And this is concerned with bringing in information regarding pain, touch, temperature. The nucleus for this in the posterior horn is substantia gelatinosa. And once these nerve fibers enter the substantia gelatinosa, they will then ascend a few segments up and a few segments below that level and cross to the opposite side. This, this fiber system of ascending and descending and crossing to the opposite side, we call these fibers posterolateral tract of Lisor. So the lateral spinothalamic tract brings in pain, touch, temperature. The nucleus for that in the posterior horn of the spinal cord is substantia gelatinosa. Then the crossing and the ascending of a few segments above and below is the posterolateral tract of Lisor. These fibers cross in the upper segment because I said they travel up to segments above and below the level at which they enter. So they cross in the upper segment, ascend upwards in the medulla. There they combine with the anterior spinothalamic tract to form a spinal lemniscus. We will go into these details of what these things are, but spinal lemniscus is both anterior and posterior spinothalamic tract traveling upwards. Then from there to pons, to midbrain, thalamus, internal capsule, corona radiata, and sensory cortex. You may not be familiar with these terms, but we will go through them one by one. Now here I have a diagram. If you follow the red line here, okay, this is the pain and temperature fibers which are coming into whichever segment of spinal cord where they have been sensed, where pain has been felt or a certain change in temperature. It can be a thoracic, cervical, sacral, any segment. So once these fibers enter, some of the fibers will go a few segments above that level, some will go a few segments below, and we call it the posterolateral tract of Lisor. Then these fibers of pain and temperature will cross to the opposite side and they will ascend as lateral spinothalamic tract, going through the medulla, the pons, the midbrain, the thalamus, and when they emerge from the thalamus, they will go through a structure called the internal capsule. The internal capsule is a structure present in the cerebral cortex where all these ascending and descending tracts are arranged. And coming out of the internal capsule, it's like a star radiation. All these fibers are going into different directions. So that emerging fibers from the internal capsule will be corona radiata, and eventually this will go to the sensory cortex because we're bringing in sensory information. So simply put, I would like you to follow this diagram because it's easier. You can see pain and touch temperature, posterolateral tract of Lisor, crossing to opposite side as lateral spinothalamic tract in contralateral column of spinal cord, ascending through medulla, pons, midbrain. Then thalamus, because thalamus is a relay station for sensory input. Then through the internal capsule and corona radiata to the sensory cortex. So this is the lateral spinothalamic tract. And the anterior spinothalamic similarly brings in the same pain and temperature information, pain, touch, and temperature. Now, the other tracts like fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis, they have to do with proprioception and balance, 2-point discrimination. And like I said, they will be concerned with the upper and lower halves of the body. So we have lateral spinothalamic, we have anterior spinothalamic, we have fasciculus cuneatus, fasciculus gracilis. Lateral and anterior spinothalamic for pain, touch, temperature, fasciculus cuneatus, fasciculus gracilis for conscious proprioception, which means that you are aware of how you are standing, how you are balancing your body. Now, the other ascending tracts I have written under the heading of unconscious proprioception or muscle joint sense pathways. And these are those tracts which travel through the spinal cord. They are bringing in information of proprioception, but they are going to end up in the cerebellum. And they are going to give you reflex unconscious proprioception. You're not aware that you're standing straight, that you're balanced, you just do it. So these have to do with unconscious muscle joint sense pathways, anterior spinocerebellar, posterior spinocerebellar, and cuneo-cerebellar. Cuneo-cerebellar is a collection of fibers which break away from the fasciculus cuneatus, which is bringing in proprioceptive information from the upper half of the body and the upper limb. And those fibers which break away from the fasciculus cuneatus and enter the cerebellum are called cuneo-cerebellar. Now here I've got this picture of the unconscious muscle joint sense, which I said was anterior spinocerebellar, posterior spinocerebellar, and cuneo-cerebellar. If you just follow this blue line here, you see unconscious muscle joint sense information coming into the spinal cord. When it ascends as posterior spinocerebellar, it will remain on the same side and through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, it will enter the cerebellum. The other pathway I want you to look at is anterior spinocerebellar. It's entering the same way, but immediately after entering, it crosses to the opposite side. Then it goes up as anterior spinocerebellar tract, and then it goes through superior cerebellar peduncle and comes out of middle and goes back to the same side. So, although it crosses in the medulla to the opposite side, but it ends up being ipsilateral. And the same way, I think they've shown cuniocerebellar as well, if I'm not mistaken. No, these are just two that they've shown here. The posterior spinocerebellar, the anterior spinocerebellar, which is contralateral and then ipsilateral, and some fibers of anterior spinocerebellar, they remain on the same side. And you must remember that the cerebellum, all the information going into the cerebellum is always ipsilateral. Now, here we have to discuss the conscious proprioception that I talked about, discriminative touch, vibration, and conscious muscle joint sense, which we said was through the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus. They'll enter, ascend in the spinal cord, and in the medulla, you will have two nuclei called nuclei gracilis and nuclei cuneatus, each for its own tract. So you will have one fasciculus gracilis and one fasciculus cuneatus for the right side, one nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus for the left side. So in all you have four nuclei in the medulla, two on each side. So these fibers of conscious proprioception will ascend on the same side up throughout the spinal cord, and when they reach their relevant nuclei in the medulla, those that will cross to the opposite side will be known as internal arcuate fibers, and then they will descend as the medial lemniscus and go to the thalamus, internal capsule, corona radiata, sensory cortex. Now, some of the fibers which ascend to the nucleus cuneatus, they won't cross. They'll just separate and go through to the cerebellum. And that will become the third tract for unconscious proprioception. So you have three tracts for unconscious proprioception: anterior spinocerebellar, posterior spinocerebellar, and cuniocerebellar. And these fibers, green, which are crossing to the opposite side and ascending and going to the cortex, these will constitute the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. Once they reach their nuclei in the medulla oblongata, they will then cross to the opposite side, and now we will call them internal arcuate fibers. And they will ascend upwards as medial lemniscus. These fibers ascending up will be medial lemniscus, thalamus, internal capsule, corona radiata, and cerebral cortex sensory. Now, I want to show you, just mention briefly, that the other ascending tracts like spinotectal, spinoreticular, spinoolivary, visceral sensory tracts, these are tracts which are going to different parts of the brain above the spinal cord. Spinotectal, wherever you hear the word tectum or tectal, you must think of midbrain. There is an area in the midbrain which is called tectum, which will, I'm not going to go into the detail, but please remember that the spinotectal tract is actually going to the midbrain, and it is concerned with movement of the eyes and the head towards source of stimulation or any visual stimulus. And this tract is crossed, as you can see, which means that this is contralateral control. Spino-reticular, you know that in the pons, in the medulla, in the midbrain, there are a collection of neurons which are concerned with our consciousness and level of alertness. And that collection of neurons is called reticular formation, which is present in pons, in medulla, in midbrain. The spino-reticular pathway is a pathway for to going to the reticular formation, and it influences level of consciousness, and the spino-reticular tract is uncrossed. Spinotectal is crossed. Spino-olivary. In the cerebellum, there is a collection of nuclei called as the olivary nuclear complex. So spino-olivary means that these fibers will travel up in the spinal cord and they will go to the cerebellum, and they will take information from cutaneous and proprioceptive organs, and it will be uncrossed because everything going to the cerebellum is ipsilateral. Then you have visceral sensory tracts. They have to do with reflex activity, and they travel up with the spinothalamic tracts, bringing in information from viscera. So, just very briefly, let's just go through this so that we can move on. Ascending tracts, lateral spinothalamic tract, pain touch temperature, substantia gelatinosa, posterolateral tract of Lisor, upper segment crossing, ascending above medulla, combining with anterior spinothalamic tract to form spinal lemniscus, then above into pons, midbrain, thalamus, through the internal capsule and corona radiata to the sensory cortex. And this was the diagram. Then you have anterior spinothalamic, fasciculus cuneatus, fasciculus gracilis. And the three which are concerned with unconscious muscle joint sense are anterior spinocerebellar, posterior spinocerebellar, and cuneocerebellar. Now, these tracts that I talked about, spinotectal, concerned with movement of the eyes and head to any stimulation, and this tract is crossed, which means contralateral. Spino-reticular, going from the spinal cord to the reticular formation, concerned with consciousness, uncrossed. Spino-olivary, going from the spinal cord to the olivary nuclear complex in the cerebellum. And visceral sensory, traveling with spinothalamic tract, concerned with reflex activity. Now here I've got a simplified table. Lateral spinothalamic, both anterior and lateral. Lateral spinothalamic, concerned with pain and temperature. Ventral or anterior spinothalamic, more to do with touch. This is actually light touch, pain and temperature. This is pressure and crude touch. Dorsal column was fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. Vibration, proprioception, 2-point discrimination. Spinocerebellar, we had two, anterior and posterior spinocerebellar, concerned with unconscious proprioception. Cuneocerebellar, again, proprioception and muscle joint, unconscious proprioception. Spinotectal, going from the spinal cord to the midbrain, tectum of the midbrain, and this is movement of head and eye to stimulus. Spino-reticular into the reticular formation, spino-olivary into the cerebellum, corticus, now we go to the descending, we are not going to talk about them. Now here I've got a diagram of a simple form of the ascending pathway tracts. This is a sensory ending. It can be for pain, it can be for touch, it can be for temperature, it can be for proprioception, and it will travel through some kind of a nerve fiber, which will enter through this afferent pathway as a nerve entering through the dorsal root ganglion to the posterior horn of the spinal cord. And from here, it will ascend. This sensory information will cross, for example, in lateral spinothalamic, it will cross to the opposite side, it will ascend, relay in the thalamus and cortex, sensory cortex. So they say that this is a three neuronal pathway, three synapses: peripheral nerve fiber, the tract, and then from thalamus to cerebral cortex for sensory information. This, I've got this diagram just to show you that these tracts that we've been talking about over here, we have fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus. See, gracilis is here, so you will have the lumbar and sacral regions bringing proprioception here. And the cuneatus is present laterally, so that will be concerned with bringing in thoracic and cervical proprioception. So this is the arrangement of fibers in the white columns. And when you have any spinal cord injury, then you can assess which part of the body will be affected. Similarly, you have spinothalamic tracts for the pain and temperature. As you can see, the deepest or the innermost are cervical, and as you come laterally, the outermost will be sacral. So, if you have some kind of compression in the periphery, you know that the lower part of the body, the pain and temperature sensations will be affected. Now we come to the next type of tracts, which are ascending tracts. Ascending tracts are lateral spinothalamic, ventral spinothalamic. Then you have spinocerebellar tracts. This we have already talked about. This is the ascending tract notes, simplified notes, and then we will go on to the descending tracts. Sorry. Lateral spinothalamic for pain and thermal stimulus, ventral spinothalamic for crude touch and pressure. Dorsal column means fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus for conscious vibration sensation, proprioception, 2 point discrimination. Spinocerebellar tracts, both anterior and posterior, plus cuniocerebellar, will conduct unconscious proprioception. And the other tracts are spinotectal. We know they have to do with movement of the eye and head to the stimulus. Then spinoreticular going to the reticular formation, and then spinoolivary going to the olivary nuclear complex. And here I have um, an introduction. We're going to start now with the descending tracts. Descending tracts are those fibers which will come down from supraspinal levels to the anterior horn of the spinal cord, and they will activate the motor neurons which are present in the anterior horn of spinal cord. So these are called descending tracts. They can arise from the cerebral cortex, they can arise from the midbrain, they can arise from the cerebellum, and they will, all these are called supraspinal levels, and they will then descend down like this. The first order neuron is this fiber which is coming down. Then in the midbrain, it crosses to the opposite side. And finally, this is going to be the third order neuron here, which is leaving. So first order neuron from high for any higher center like the cerebral cortex, then crossing to the opposite side, descending in the spinal cord, and when it enters into the anterior column of the anterior horn of the spinal cord, that's the second order neuron, and from there you have the third order neuron which will go to the skeletal muscle. So this is a three neuron pathway. One coming from the higher center, two crossing to the opposite side and going to the spinal cord, three emerging from the spinal cord to go to the muscle. Now, descending tracts are concerned with motor activity. This is a simplified diagram which I want you to see, that when you have any information coming in, they have not showed you that arrow because this is for the descending tracts. This is the dorsal root ganglion. Sensory information comes in, first order neuron, dorsal root ganglion. Then nerve fiber takes it to the posterior horn of the spinal cord. Now we have to talk about what's happening when you have motor activity. For motor activity, you will have a higher center bringing down fibers, and they will be called tracts, lateral corticospinal tracts and other tracts that we'll talk about. These tracts will remain in the white matter, and they will then send fibers to the anterior horn neurons. These neurons will be activated and they will then send out efferent pathway for motor activity. This is again another diagram that I want to show you. You see area 4 and 6 of the cerebral cortex are concerned with motor activity. 3, 2 and 1 are concerned with sensory activity. I'm not going to go into further details because that we will do when we get to that part of neuroanatomy. Now can you see this? You have different fibers coming down from different parts of the cerebral cortex. And this is actually corona radiata that I was talking to you about. This is the internal capsule. And then through the midbrain and pons and medulla, then some will remain on the same side and some will cross. This is a diagram of a very important tract which is called corticospinal tracts. Now, descending tracts, motor neurons in the anterior gray in the anterior gray column of the spinal cord, they are known as lower motor neurons. Lower motor neurons are influenced by cerebral cortex, midbrain, pons, medulla. These fibers come down and aggregate in white matter of spinal cord, and we call them descending tracts. Upper motor neurons are those neurons which are present at supraspinal level and they influence motor activity. Corticospinal tract, very important to remember. You have two. You have lateral corticospinal tract and anterior corticospinal tract. These corticospinal tracts, like the name suggests, they will come down from the cerebral cortex. These fibers are actually descending from neurons which are present in the cerebral cortex, like this picture. These are the fibers of the corticospinal tracts. And in the books, they say that one third of the fibers will be from the primary motor cortex, which is area 4. One third will be from the secondary motor cortex, area 6, and the rest of the one third of fibers will be from the sensory cortex, area 3, 1, 2. Collectively, we call the aggregation of all these fibers corticospinal tract. Now, the body is represented in a certain way in the motor cortex, which is called homunculus. I'll show you a picture of that as well. But you must remember that this corticospinal tract is going to then descend Same pathway, corona radiata, except that it's coming down. From the corona radiata through the internal capsule to the basis pedunculi of midbrain. Then they become transverse pontocerebellar fibers in the pons. And in the medulla, they aggregate as elevations called pyramids. And here, majority of the descending fibers of the corticospinal tract cross to the opposite side, and this is called the pyramidal decussation. Those fibers which cross to the opposite side are called lateral corticospinal tract. This is present throughout the segments of the spinal cord. And this is the major portion, the lateral corticospinal tract. Fibers which do not decussate or cross at the level of the pyramids in the medulla, they descend on the same side and they are called anterior corticospinal tracts. They are present only in the cervical and upper thoracic segments. Now I'm just going to go back and show you this. These are the fibers of the corticospinal tract coming from different parts of the cerebral cortex. Then they become this corona radiata enters into the internal capsule. Then from the internal capsule through the midbrain. Here we the area of the midbrain is called basis pedunculi, where the corticospinal tract travels. Then in the pons, we call them transverse pontocerebellar fibers because they are broken up by the nuclei present in the pons. Then in the medulla. Now in the medulla, you can see in this picture, these are the pyramids. In these elevations, these corticospinal tract fibers, they will come and form an elevation. And then those which will cross will be called lateral spinothalamic tract. And those which will not cross in the pyramids in the medulla will come down as anterior corticospinal tracts. So I hope this picture helps you to understand what we are talking about and what their importance is. We know that the lateral corticospinal tract is crossed. It crosses at the level of the medulla, the pyramids of the medulla, and it is called the pyramidal decussation. They are going to be called the lateral corticospinal tract fibers, and those fibers which do not cross but descend on the same side are called anterior corticospinal. And anterior corticospinal are only in the cervical and upper thoracic segments. The corticospinal tracts are concerned with discrete movement. There's something wrong here. Okay, can you hear me? I hope you can hear me. The descending tracts, corticospinal. They are concerned with discrete, voluntary, skilled movement, especially in the distal limbs. And for smooth, coordinated movements to take place, these corticospinal tracts will give branches back to the cerebral cortex so that the other areas are inhibited. For example, if you want to move your hand and you want to write, your elbow and your shoulder have to remain stationary. So, when it's coming down, the corticospinal tract will give back inhibitory cells, inhibitory fibers to the cerebral cortex. It will also have a communication with the basal ganglia, the caudate nucleus, the lentiform nucleus, and it will also have connections with the red nucleus, the olivary nuclei, and the reticular formation. This is all done so that smooth and skilled and controlled movement can take place. Now, the main descending tracts are the corticospinal. In addition to that, you have rubrospinal tract, tectospinal tract, reticulospinal tract, and olivospinal tract. Now, this is a simplified diagram. We know that all these tracts are going to be influenced by the cerebral cortex. So, the cerebral cortex is influencing the red nucleus, from which you will have rubrospinal. The cerebral cortex is influencing the tectum of the midbrain, from which you will have tectospinal. The cerebral cortex is going to influence the reticular formation in the pons, in the medulla, in the midbrain, from which you will have reticulospinal tract. And the cerebral cortex will influence the olivary nuclei in the cerebellum, from which you will have olivospinal tract. Now, the reticulospinal, going to the reticular formation. The reticulospinal tract is actually going to come from the reticular formation in the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And here you will have two types of tracts. Those coming from the pontine reticulospinal area, that pontine reticulospinal tract will be uncrossed, means it will remain on the same side. The medullary reticulospinal tract will contain both crossed and uncrossed fibers, and they will influence voluntary movement, reflex activity, and they are considered to be a part of the autonomic nervous system because it is thought that the hypothalamus is facilitated in control of sympathetic and parasympathetic activity by the reticulospinal tract. Now, this is a picture of what I am talking about. You have reticular formation at all these levels. You see medulla, pons, midbrain. And if you see here, just follow what I was trying to tell you. For example, you have all this reticular formation, these brown dots and lines, all this reticular formation. In the medulla oblongata, some of these fibers coming from reticular formation will cross and they'll go down. We will call them medullary reticulospinal tract. Okay. And some of them will not cross and they will come down as pontine reticulospinal. So they are going to come down to different levels of the spinal cord. And where are they coming from? They're coming from reticular formation. Some fibers will be crossed, some fibers will be uncrossed. Now, the tectum of the midbrain. There is a collection of nuclei in the tectum of the midbrain concerned with visual reflexes, and that nucleus is called superior colliculus. From the superior colliculus of the midbrain, the fibers will emerge and cross, and they are going to be in the upper cervical segment of the spinal cord only. Tectospinal tract is present in the cervical segment of the spinal cord. It is a crossed tract and it is concerned with reflex postural movement in response to visual stimulus. The rubrospinal tract, on the other hand, is going to emerge from the red nucleus, which is again in the midbrain. It's going to cross, and the rubrospinal tract facilitates flexor muscle activity and inhibits extensor muscle activity. And this tract, the rubrospinal tract, also receives input from cortex and cerebellum to influence alpha and gamma motor neuron activity. Now here I have a diagram. This is the tectum of the midbrain, and this is the superior colliculus, which is concerned with the eye and the visual stimulus. From the superior colliculus, fibers of this tract will cross to the opposite side and they will then descend as tectospinal tract in the white column of spinal cord. And they will influence reflex activity of the eye and head, and this is only going to be present in the cervical segment of the spinal cord. Rubrospinal will emerge from the red nucleus which is in the midbrain, Immediately after emerging from the red nucleus, these fibers cross to the opposite side and they descend as rubrospinal tract. And this also has to do with motor activity. And here we have vestibulospinal. Vestibulospinal tract is, like the name suggests, it has to do with balance. And these fibers are going to come from the vestibular nuclei, which are concerned with balance. These vestibular nuclei will emerge and give fibers which will descend as vestibulospinal tract, concerned with balance. And here you have olivospinal tract. Olivospinal tract, like the name suggests, it's from the cerebellum, from the olivary nuclei of the cerebellum, cross to the opposite side and they are descending down. And again, they are going to be concerned with motor activity. Now, I have uh, gone over almost all the important aspects of the spinal cord, the neurons of the spinal cord, and the tracts, the ascending and the descending tracts. I will upload this lecture on YouTube so that those of you who missed yesterday's lecture on Zoom, you can have the whole slides together. And we will continue because I have to discuss with you the clinical correlates of the spinal cord and what happens when you have certain injuries of the spinal cord. And that we will do on Monday. And I will tell you what time by 12 o'clock Monday afternoon. Thank you.